Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Brian Clark, a senior fellow at the Institute. And today we're here to talk with Chris Brose, whose new book, The Kill Chain, Defending America's Defending America in the Future of High-Tech Warfare, that Chris Brose just released. Chris is a former staff director for the Senate Armed Services Committee. Prior to that, he was the senior policy advisor for Senator John McCain and previously held other positions in the government. Right now, he is the Chief Strategy Officer of Anduril Industries that builds capabilities for the military as well as the Department of Homeland Security, I believe. We could talk about that as we go through this interview. But welcome, Chris. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Oh, thanks, Brian. It's great to be here.
So just to start off with, what kind of led you to do this book? I know you've been thinking about these issues for a while, and obviously this is something you've encountered during your several years, both on the Armed Services Committee and advising Senator McCain as a policy advisor. But what was the genesis that led to you really sitting down and writing an entire book?
Yeah, it's a great question. I ask myself that constantly. Why did I get into this? Every day I was working on it. I'd say, I guess it was basically two things. One was, and both of these were kind of a product of the many years that I spent working on these issues when I was in the Senate and, just kind of thinking about this stuff on a day-to-day basis. The first was just sort of the growing realization in the years that I was there that, we just had a fundamental problem that I felt was kind of underappreciated. It's not to say that people didn't appreciate that we were losing competitive advantage, that we weren't where we needed to be from a technological standpoint and, to a certain extent, an operational standpoint. It was mostly just the sense that I didn't think there was the urgency to get after that problem that we needed, right, considering how fast that problem was closing on us. And in some respects, actually, I think how far behind that problem we actually are. Right. The second was really then sort of, again, the thinking that I had been doing around, well, what do we do about this? And, on the one hand, there's a lot of talk about, the threat and sort of the operational problems presented by a peer competitor like China. There's a lot of talk about technology and sort of the importance of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and autonomous systems to really being essential to, kind of enhancing America's competitive advantage from a military standpoint. It didn't feel to me, though, that there were kind of concrete answers coming together. So it's like, what do I do with this new technology? How does it allow me to think differently, build new kinds of capabilities, operate in different ways that are actually going to create competitive advantage for the United States military? There's sort of a sense that we were talking about these technologies, as like we're just going to layer them on top of the things we've always had and the way we've always operated, and we're just going to be able to do it better.
Right. Right.
So, from my standpoint, look, I mean, I sort of was living at the nexus of these worlds, from the technological standpoint. Really, I think, on the Hill, kind of looking at the emergence of these technologies, kind of the DoD's treatment of them, attempt to develop them, and then obviously kind of looking at the operational problems and threat briefings and discussions with the Department of Defense. So my view on it was, okay, well, is there a way to sort of help bridge this divide or this gap between, what it is we think we might be able to do with new technologies and what are the things that we are going to need to do or want to do differently from an operational standpoint, and sort of, in a broader strategic context, kind of where are we going? What is this next kind of era going to look like? That was essentially the origins of it. And honestly, it was more of an attempt for me to get my own, sort of head around these problems, as it was to sort of say, like, here's my contribution to what I think the answers look like.
Right. So, and I totally agree that we are at a kind of a juncture where we need to make some decisions as a nation and as a Department of Defense on how we're going to deal with the problem that, in particular, China poses, but more pretty much any high-tech competitor is going to pose, because we still are lugging around a very legacy military that's not quite changed how it operates or changes how it's postured to take advantage or exploit new technologies that are becoming available. So it seems like one thing you're really focused on is the idea that it's not just about building these new technologies, because arguably they've been around for a few years, and Anduril even does some of this work, obviously. It's about changing the way that we're going to use, the way we're going to fight, the way we're going to use these technologies in terms of the operational concepts. And you talk a little bit in there about the idea of human command and machine control, which I think is an interesting way of describing what the department often characterizes as manned-unmanned teaming, which
Right.
kind of makes it seem like the manned system and the unmanned system are on par with one another, and they're going to go out and act as a team, and if they get separated, they can operate independently, and if they come back together, they can team up again, which is obviously not a correct way to characterize or consider the introduction of unmanned or autonomous systems. So how do you think of that new way of operating that we're going to need to embrace with the advent of autonomous systems? And then we can maybe talk about AI as an added element to that.
Yeah, for sure. So first off, to give credit where credit is due, human command and machine teaming was your phrase that you coined with Dan Patt, which I give credit to both of you in the book for. And I thought it was actually it encapsulated the way I thought about it very nicely, which is why I sort of gave it pride of place. The reason I don't like machine manned unmanned teaming is the sense that the manned and the unmanned system are equals. And that they're somehow on equal footing, which I just dislike. And I think the other piece of it is there sort of is this tendency to believe that these new technologies are just so fundamentally new and different that the way that we've always thought about kind of the control of military operations, all of the law, policy, norms, and procedures that have sort of governed this in the past are somehow going to be thrown out the window because this stuff is just fundamentally different. My own view is that it just isn't. It's going to be much more of a kind of movement along a continuum from where we have been than sort of some brand new era. And ultimately, I think it really does kind of come back to this question of command and control, which is again a very familiar military concept. And I think it's helpful to sort of take the systems out of it and really kind of get to the question of what we're ultimately talking about is the performance of military tasks. Those tasks are going to continue to be performed. The question is sort of who or what is going to be performing them. You're still going to have superior actors who are controlling subordinate actors. Traditionally, that's been human superiors commanding human subordinates. But I think as these systems become more intelligent and more autonomous, some of those kind of lower, more technical, kind of repetitive tasks, more mundane tasks that take an inordinate amount of human time in the U.S. military right now. I mean, we have tens of thousands of humans who are doing processing, exploitation, dissemination, of sensor information, just as one example. Increasingly more of those tasks could be performed by, more intelligent, more autonomous machines. That doesn't mean that they're going to just be off, kind of like doing it on their own. It's still going to be, again, through the same architecture or framework of command and control now, where humans set very clear parameters for, the control of military tasks. You are going to test significantly and train significantly the subordinate actors who are going to perform those tasks. And in the process of training and testing, you're going to build trust that they can do the thing that you are giving them responsibility to do. We talk about autonomous systems as if, there is such a thing. The reality is autonomy describes the relationship between a human who is delegating tasks to someone or something other than that. So, in that respect, I think it's really more around, sort of what are the standards by which we are, going to be able to come to trust machines to perform tasks that currently or sort of previously only humans could perform. But I don't think the way in which we're going to do that is going to be any different than the way that we sort of evaluate humans in that respect, or evaluate kind of less intelligent machines that we've been relying on for a very long time. We have processes in place to do this. And I think that's actually going to be something that we should spend more time thinking through as a construct for, how this can help us govern the, kind of emergence of and use of these new technologies in the future.
Yep, absolutely. So in terms of the autonomous systems, or the systems that are exerting some control over their own actions, there's a couple of different flavors, and you talk about it a little bit in the book about you've got essentially higher sophisticated systems. You've got like global hawks and systems that are very expensive, relatively small numbers of them. They can operate relatively independently and do some of their own mission planning and to respond to some of the stimuli in the environment. And then you've got cheap systems that are somewhat expendable, maybe even disposable, and they operate independently, but their scope of action is very constrained. They're not really able to make a lot of decisions by themselves. Obviously, there's a role for both of those. What I'm curious about is when you think about new ways of operating that exploit autonomous systems and unmanned systems, how do you see the relationship, or how would you see both of those families of unmanned systems being used? Are you looking to essentially, are you trying to do like a war of attrition, Ender's Game? I'm going to throw a bunch of disposable cheap things at somebody and just overwhelm them. Do you see that as being a component of a larger force that maybe uses that episodically, but maybe the rest of the force is pursuing a set of more traditional maneuver actions, and these expendable robots are just an element of that? So, how would you see the different types of unmanned systems being employed in military operations, as opposed to just to kind of throw a bunch of human or robot waves at people?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think perhaps the sort of the point that unifies the two, certainly in the present sense, is whether it's a Global Hawk or something smaller and cheaper. We talk about them as unmanned systems, but they're actually pretty exquisitely manned when you really kind of look beneath the hood and see all of the different particular tasks that are being performed by human beings remotely. In the case of many of these unmanned systems, in order to make them operationally useful. And I think, to me, the big change is going to be, rather than having one unmanned system or one manned system that requires an exquisite amount of human beings behind it to make it operationally useful. It's actually the inversion of that command and control relationship, where you can now have a single human being in command of large quantities of systems. Right. So, to get at your question, I think, the real opportunity here is kind of getting mass back on our side. Mm-hmm. That for many, many, many years, right, we have made the choice around, kind of being qualitatively superior, even in the face of, kind of a quantitatively superior adversary. And we've been able to do that because we've had, kind of exquisite technological overmatch that's allowed us to hide, evade detection, penetrate into enemy spaces, fire a limited number of times, but exquisitely accurately. Right. So, to me, I think, the opportunity of flipping this back to say, all right, well, from an operational standpoint, hiding is going to become harder. I am going to have to confront larger waves of systems coming at me. And I think autonomy really opens up the possibility of being able to put mass back on our side. And to your point, fight some of these wars of attrition, smarter and cheaper, than maybe we had been expecting to. In terms of how that allows us to also then fight differently, other than just we're going to kind of grind each other down and the last person standing wins, which I think there's something to be said for that. I do think the ability to operate faster is going to be, another critical component of this, right? And you've written eloquently about this in terms of sort of a decision-centric model. And that's ultimately kind of why I focused on the kill chain as an organizing concept for the book, which is, it's ultimately not the sort of particular platforms or the pieces of the systems that are interesting. It's ultimately the ability to understand what's going on, to rapidly make decisions and take relevant actions, and sort of increasing the quantity and quality of that, the speed and the scale by which you can operate. Where, again, as you've written, you create so many different dilemmas for the adversary that it just fractures their ability to make decisions. I do think that is something that autonomous systems are going to provide us, a real capability advantage in, sort of separate and apart from basically just, we're going to grind each other down, and at the end of the day, we're going to have more systems on the battlefield than our competitor, which again is nothing to scoff at. I think is sort of an operational outcome.
Yeah, and we found in the wargaming that we did, looking at these kinds of concepts, is that the players, they like the idea of being able to do the attrition attack and just throw a bunch of something at the adversary and overwhelm their defenses. But what they liked is having the ability to do that, as well as do some exquisite attacks. That's while the adversary is busy dealing with the attrition battle that's happening, elsewhere. They can focus a smaller number of platforms that still might be autonomous, but they're going to go do the kind of pinpoint strikes against the command and control nodes, the long range sensors, those capabilities that are really the things that are the game changers in terms of the way the battle is going to proceed. So getting that decision advantage also takes, taking away his eyes while simultaneously keeping his hands busy was something that in the war games we found very helpful.
Well, just to build on that, I mean, I think, the point that I try to stress in the book is that, what's best is really kind of putting the focus on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve rather than getting, kind of overly consumed with, what type of system is actually going to be most relevant. Because again, I'm prepared to believe that, the best answers to these problems of how do you build the sort of effective battle network that's going to solve these operational problems. It could be all legacy systems used in new ways. It could be a mixture of sort of old technologies and new technologies. At the end of the day, it could be all brand new things. At the end of the day, it really shouldn't matter sort of how you combine these things. But I think, again, in a point you've made so well, you have to be able to combine them, in a more elegant and a more dynamic way, so that you can sort of build these different battle networks that are not just entirely all brand new things or all, kind of exquisite sort of point-to-point connected old things, but really be able to get those interesting kind of synergies between, a 40, 30, 50-year-old platform and some brand new autonomous system that was developed yesterday.
Exactly. So let's talk a little bit about where the U.S. has a competitive advantage here. So you kind of talk about, we could talk a little bit about how you would actually implement this kind of force and what we could leverage in terms of the U.S. technological base. But also, where do you see the kind of the fundamental advantages where the U.S. would be able to better exploit these emerging technologies than an adversary like a China?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of these technologies, we still, as a nation, still have, considerable advantages and considerable capability. I think the challenge is just, aligning the advantages and capability that we do have with the actual military problems that we're facing. And this is the sort of, familiar conundrum of how do you get, companies and kind of founders and others who are working in these technologies, but are really focused on kind of commercial applications and not interested or actively opposed to working on, kind of military problems. I think that is going to be a conundrum for us. I think, one of the biggest advantages that the United States has is just, kind of the operational expertise and excellence that we have in the United States military. Sort of separate and apart from the technology areas is, it's hard to replace, just the amount of time that we have spent, solving operational problems, actually, dealing with these types of challenges in combat. It's not something that we should be overly reliant upon because, a lot of these problems are going to be new and different. But from the standpoint of really thinking about how you solve operational problems, how you kind of bring the joint force together to do that, I think we have a lot of ability there. But at the same time, I think we need to be realistic that there are a lot of aspects of how China is going to develop and use these technologies that could very well give it a leg up over us. When it comes to scale, when it comes to data collection and retention, certainly when it comes to being shall we say, less interested in some of the ethical concerns that I think, we spend a lot of time rightly focused on. That when you have a government that's sort of founded on a distrust of its own people, my sense is they're going to be a lot more willing to kind of delegate these types of decisions to autonomous machines than the United States is. So I think it is going to be, a long-term competition where we will have to look for areas of advantage, and we may not always be the sort of the leader in these areas. The question is how quickly can we bring these technologies in and integrate them into the force to make them operationally relevant. I think that's something that we actually have done quite well in recent years, but this is a very different type of challenge, and we need to be mindful of the fact that much of what we've learned over the past 20 years may not all be transferable to this kind of great power competition era.
So one interesting thing that comes out of the way you were describing how unmanned systems or autonomous systems might get used and how some of the wargaming that we did played out was that if you are going to use your unmanned systems to try to gain a decision advantage, meaning you're going to use them to be able to operate faster in time, but also faster by operating at scale and giving the adversary more things to look at. So if you can speed up your decision cycle and improve its quality like that, and hopefully you're creating enough deception and enough confusion on the adversary side that he's slowing his own decision cycle, then it seems like one thing we maybe will rely on is mission command. So the idea that a U.S. force has been trained in such a way that they are willing to improvise, use their own initiative. When communications are lost, they're willing to accept tactics that might not ordinarily be what they would turn to based on doctrine. So it seems like the willingness of U.S. leaders to be able to take advantage of their own initiative and ability to improvise might be an advantage if you're looking at a decision-centric fight where you're having to kind of use your own unmanned systems that are under your command to come up with a tactic in the absence of a planning staff or some higher direction. So yeah, definitely it seems like that might be a form of competitive advantage as well.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the challenge is, the United States military is going to have to relearn a lot about mission command as well.
Yeah.
But I think to your point, we're much better positioned to do that than, an adversary that's very top down. There was sort of an inherent distrust in the lower ranks.
Yeah.
I think that is 100%, kind of an advantage that we have. But, that's something that we're also going to have to relearn after, 20 years where we certainly practiced a lot of mission command in a lot of places, but that wasn't necessarily, the way a lot of these conflicts were structured.
Right. That's right. So that brings me to a point that I think a lot of people will ask is, how do we actually make this transition? So you discussed, and we've discussed in our own writings on this subject, that you don't have to transition to this robot force of autonomous systems right away. This could be an element of the force that gets gradually built up over time, and even a 10% contribution to the force of unmanned systems or autonomous systems makes a big difference in your operational outcomes. But how do we, other than just going back to the defense contractors and saying, building a bunch of unmanned systems, are there better ways that DoD could be trying to take advantage of this enormous tech industrial base in the United States to try to field unmanned systems and AI-enabled command and control, management tools more quickly than it would if it goes through the normal acquisition pipeline?
Yeah, it's to me, I mean, this is the sort of $64 million question. It's certainly one thing to talk about all of this. I think the much harder challenge is how to do it. And again, that was, something that really kind of hit home for me and was really eye-opening in the course of doing the book is how so many of the things that we are now saying are things that we have said over the past 20 to 30 years. Network-centric warfare. I mean, it all sort of rings true and very similar to, I think many of the things that are being said and written now. And you kind of have to go back and ask, well, why did we fail to do or not do so many of the things that we said were so important, for so many years? Part of it, I think, is we haven't gotten the incentives right, and that was kind of a main emphasis that I put in the book. I'm a big believer in incentives, and I think to a large extent, we've gotten exactly what we've paid for. And I think the way that you begin to change that is you have to focus on the actual things that you're trying to buy. I'm a big baseball fan, a big fan of the shift to sabermetrics, where we're now measuring team outcomes rather than sort of player inputs. I think in much the same way, getting into a position where we're actually competing out the things that we are trying to do, measured based on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, so that there's an actual process and kind of a repetitive process every year, with a certain amount of money held in sort of reserve, kind of at the beginning of the year by the senior leaders of the Department of Defense, with the Congress's support, to say, we are trying to sort of reduce the time to close kill chains. We're trying to kind of enhance the decision-making advantage of U.S. forces. We need to measure it against specific operational problems that those forces are going to have to confront. We have to get away from these kinds of broader buzzwords like joint all-domain command and control or multi-domain operations, which, we could sort of have an informed debate about what they mean, but you have to really boil them down to the specific military problems that you're going to have to solve under the conditions that you're going to have to solve them. Against real world adversaries, not sort of, generalized competitors. And I think that if you actually begin competing that out every year, um, you have an ability to see what is performing best, and I think that's the best way to kind of navigate this transition. Where initially, look, much of that force is going to be our legacy force,
Right.
and then the question is going to be, how can these technologies enable that legacy force to to be faster, to scale more significantly, and that'll be the question of how technology enables kind of current operations, current force. And eventually, you'll start to see areas where new technologies, new capabilities will replace legacy systems because they're capable of performing better as part of that integrated battle network. But unless you're measuring the thing you're actually trying to do, then it's just sort of every man for himself, and it doesn't really get you the kind of data-driven outputs that you want, so that you can direct what is ultimately, I think, going to be a decreasing amount of resources toward the force you're trying to build. And I think the other piece of that is that it begins to create the incentives for industry to really understand that if they put their own money towards solving these problems, they have a path to getting into actually have a merit-based competition where if they go out and fund a new battle management system or a new aircraft or weapon, there's actually the prospect that the Department of Defense has a mechanism, and the Congress has a mechanism for on-ramping that at scale very quickly. And by the way, if someone shows up with a better capability than you this year, don't worry, because you'll have the opportunity to come back and compete next year. This won't work for everything, right? I mean, you're going to be limited, with larger, more capital-intensive programs like aircraft carriers and the like. But there should just be a lot more attempt to sort of put competition back into, not in the sense we mean sort of acquisition competition at the front end, but constant operational competition to determine what are the systems that you should actually be putting resources in, and scaling them pretty considerably, so that again, you begin to see that the Department of Defense is moving money toward the things that they actually say are important. And I think that's the thing that that I look at, and certainly looked at from my time on the Hill, is that what senior leaders, what senior members of Congress say is interesting. What they spend money on is actually what is going to move the needle in terms of programmatic choices, and then investment choices on the part of private industry and the investment community.
So that brings up a couple of very interesting points. That was a fascinating discussion right there. So one is requirements. The Department of Defense builds requirements today, essentially using a system engineering approach, where it determines how it thinks it's going to be configured in the future. It determines what it thinks the future scenarios are likely to look like, and then they do essentially a analysis to figure out, well, what are the capability gaps? Given that assumption for how I'm going to fight, the assumptions for what that threat looks like, and the assumptions for what my available forces will look like in 20 years from now. So there's a bunch of assumptions built into it, and it's to come up with a point solution. What you're talking about is a very different, which is not a point solution that you're driving toward, but instead, more of a bottom-up attempt to improve mission outcomes. So the Department of Defense would establish, here's missions we think are important, here's outcomes we want to have happen, here's a range of environments in which those outcomes are needed. China in the South China Sea, or in the Baltic or something. And it sounds like that's what you're talking about here. So it's much more of the Joint Staff comes up with outcomes and mission or in military problems they want to address, and then a lot of the job of the Department of Defense is to harvest ideas and assess their ability to improve those outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You said it very well. I think that unless we are actually focusing on kind of the joint outcomes that we're trying to achieve, we're going to end up buying a bunch of things that may or may not actually achieve those outcomes. And I think part of my problem with the requirements process, quote unquote, is just the degree of hubris, I think, that's kind of baked into it, which is somewhat befitting, right? I mean, the experience that we've just had of 30 years post-Cold War, sort of top of the heap. But I just don't think that's really going to hold up for us in the future. It's kind of a hackneyed example, but if I had to let my own requirements for my mobile device, I'd have the best flip phone in America right now. We've got to get beyond this idea that if it's not invented in the defense establishment or cooked up inside of the Department of Defense, it's somehow no good. I'd be much more interested in every year being able to say, look, I have to I have to be able to defend forward bases
Right.
from large quantities of incoming weapons. I don't care how I do that. I don't care with what I do that. The question is, can we field a better solution that's, reduces the likelihood that my forward bases are smoking holes in the ground 48 hours into the start of a conflict? And focusing on that outcome, and then the capabilities that would come together as the thing that are really going to drive the expensive resources. Expense of resources, not expensive resources, but it'll probably require that too. And just iterating on that so that every year there's an understanding of, whatever wins is going to get funded. And we're going to come right back and figure out if there's a better way to do this next year, and it's going to significantly move the needle on the money that we're spending.
So that kind of raises the question of, intellectual property rights, and how do we design software, or essentially software, so that companies can have that opportunity to compete and win the contract next year, even if they didn't win it this year, because you're going to have a system that's already been developed, or some parts of a system of systems that you're going to need to introduce your capability into. And you want to incentivize companies to do this, so you don't want to tell them where you're going to have to give up all your IP in the process of competing in this effort to try to provide systems to the U.S. government. So there's lots of opportunities to try to create a model or a environment where companies can retain their intellectual property rights while also modifying systems on a very regular basis. Have you been thinking about that? I mean, this is probably something Anduril deals with in terms of bringing in other people's systems and trying to integrate those with your own.
Yeah, and I think it's, to me, this is one of the core problems that we're going to have to solve. And I think, the department is very right to, criticize industry, or I would argue sort of criticize itself, for too often in recent years, kind of becoming beholden to proprietary solutions from industry, where they've been locked in black boxes that they've been incapable of sort of, updating themselves out of, and sort of moving at the speed that technology is allowing them to move. That's all true and valid. My concern is that the backlash against that is going to lead toward the belief that, well, it should all just be government owned. Right. As if we would say, well, our experience of the F-35 has been a real downer. So, the government is going to build its own high performance aircraft from now on. It's just nonsense. I think the real challenge is figuring out what are the parts of that architecture that the government is going to have to own and define to ensure that you do have sort of openness, scalability, extensibility in the future. So things like, the applications programming interfaces, reference architecture, to a certain extent, standards. Those are things that the government is going to have to, I think, define, but then really kind of allow industry to be entrepreneurial and creative about how they bring solutions to bear. Again, I don't think it's terribly difficult. I think the way we saw this play out with the commercial internet was, you had a handful of the major movers, get together and sort of hammer out a set of architectures and standards, and then sort of iteratively improve it as we go, which is why, I have an Apple computer right now that's, I think, running, a Google application, while I'm writing Microsoft Word documents, that nobody mandated that had to be so. It was mostly just kind of creating the incentives for people to play together in a way that, then people can develop applications on top of it. These new things can be developed without a sense of, I have to know exactly what the future is going to look like in 10 years and build toward that. It hasn't worked well for us when we've tried to do that in the past, and it's only going to get worse if we keep trying to do it in the future. It's mostly, I think, trying to determine what are the core things that the government really has to define to really turn industry and sort of the private sector loose on these problems in a way that you get the best capability, you get an rapidly evolving capability, but at the end of the day, the government, can still have confidence that all of this stuff is going to come together and cohere. The same way when I buy a new sensor for my house, I can plug it into the, kind of the architecture that I'm running in, in my environment here. It's totally doable. And this is the thing that I kind of come back to in the book is like, this isn't witchcraft. This is things that the United States military and service members are doing every day in their private lives. There's no reason why we can't do this in defense, and yet we're 10 years behind where the commercial world is in this respect.
Yeah, to kind of close out here, it seems like one of the things we'll have to do is incentivize industry also from a financial perspective. So we can make it easier for new commercial or for new players to enter and offer solutions to these military problems. But they're used to getting 20-time returns. They're used to VC money being used to support 10x and 20x returns. And if you're getting 10% returns, that's probably not a very successful use of VC money. So companies that are from that world are going to have difficulty seeing the value in trying to compete for DoD dollars. Is there a way that the DoD or the government can better incentivize those companies that are used to much higher returns in the commercial side?
I think that they can definitely do better as far as creating better incentives. But I think the reality is that, look, I mean, working in the defense space, you're not going to get the kind of returns that a commercial software startup is going to get. So I think to a certain extent, there's going to need to be kind of a baseline set of expectations that maybe you can do better than the 2 or 3% that sort of traditional industry is returning. But you're not going to get to the 20% returns that kind of commercial software is going to get. I think that's a doable proposition. But I think again, from the government standpoint, they need to get out of this mentality that they so value cost certainty and sort of controlling the profits of industry that they would rather pay $1 billion for something and know that industry only got 2.5% profit as opposed to pay $400 million, with industry getting 20% profit. At the end of the day, we need to be, kind of aligned toward what's really important here. But I think, from the standpoint of creating those incentives, you're going to see a lot more companies and engineers and technologists and investors interested in being involved in national defense if the government is actually buying the emerging technologies that they say are important, that these companies and founders and investors want to build. So I honestly, I think we overthink a lot of this from the standpoint of, why is Silicon Valley or why is the technology community not doing more with respect to the DoD? And I think a lot of it boils down to, look, if you were actually buying and deploying this technology at scale, you would see a lot more engineers who thought they could make a successful career doing national defense work. You'd see a lot more companies getting founded, and you'd see a lot more private investment going into modernizing national defense as opposed to optimizing advertising algorithms for social media. Absolutely. There's a degree of supply and demand here, and the government needs to create that demand. And I think if they do and actually put money behind what's important, you'll slowly, but nonetheless, I think significantly, start to see industry respond, and traditional industry too. Part of the thing that I raise in the book is you kind of look at a lot of these kind of earlier attempts at unmanned systems, autonomous systems, aircraft, weapons, things that are, struggling for funding for years. They get canceled prematurely. That doesn't exactly send a strong incentive to traditional industry that this is something that they should really be prioritizing in their portfolio when, their traditional offerings are getting funded in considerably, larger increments.
Right. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you very much for being with us today. Chris Brose, Chief Strategy Officer for Anduril Industries. Most recent book, The Kill Chain, Defending America and the Future of High-Tech Warfare. And it's available right now. I'm sure it's available many places, in addition to Amazon, where I think I got my copy. Awesome. Thank you very much, Chris, for being with us today. And good luck on the book.
Excellent. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for everything that you're doing. It's a pleasure to chat with you. And as I hope you saw in the book, there's a lot of that's got your fingerprints and influence all over it. So I will give you credit where credit is due, but I will take all of the blame for things that I mangled and got wrong. But honestly, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. It's great having you on. And thank you very much, everyone, for being with us today. This is Brian Clark for the Hudson Institute signing out, and stay safe.
Thanks.